What's up, everybody? So this discussion should be fairly short. It's kind of a continuation of a video that I made last week regarding the opening week sales for Mario Tennis Fever in Japan. We've gotten the next bit of relevant data on how well that game is doing. But to quickly recap, the game opened up in Japan, selling roughly, I think it was around 65 to 70% fewer units than Mario Tennis Aces managed when it launched. And actually, I had laid out a chart that showed that, at retail at least, it sold even fewer units than the Wii U. More specifically, Mario Tennis Ultra Smash for the Wii U. So it had a bad launch and underperformed in comparison to these other titles that launched to a Japanese market that was roughly the same size user base. Now, one of the things that people were mentioning to me was the fact that I didn't speak about how well Mario Tennis Fever did in the UK, suggesting that I completely ignored it because it debuted in second in the first week of UK. Now, obviously we've been through this before, but a very big reason why I do not discuss chart rankings is because they more often than not do not include any actual hard data. They just show a list of what sold the best in that specific week or month or whatever. This is a very big reason why Nintendo eShop charts don't really mean much to me, because when a game isn't first on the eShop chart, for example, it only shows the ranking of what sold the best in the last 4 days. And if it happens to be a very slow week, a mid-tier or low-tier game could easily top that list. If you think about all of the different third-party titles that managed to top the list throughout the weeks every time one of them launched, it made a lot of people assume that third parties were doing well on the Nintendo Switch too. And then of course, as soon as the financial reports come around, we find out that not only are the third parties not doing well on the Switch 2, but first parties are not really doing that well either. Since we know that across the board the software sales have been disappointing, but even despite that, all of the third-party sales together barely make a relevant fraction of the entirety of the software that's been sold on the Nintendo Switch 2. A good example of this would be in the States. We saw that Madden debuted in its first month on the Nintendo Switch 2 at number 2. And this obviously wrongfully led people to believe that Madden was doing well on the Nintendo Switch 2. But we know that software is not moving very well, and third-party software is moving even worse. So the Switch 2 portion of those sales is probably not very relevant. But guess what? Madden for the Switch 2 charted on the Amazon bestsellers. Madden for the Switch 2 charted on the eShop. But if we don't have actual hard data that suggests how well something is doing, we don't really know what it means when it's charting high. We just know that Madden happened to be doing very well, and of course it did because the only first-party games that had come out by that point in time was Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Kart World, so it wasn't really that hard for a new game to chart. Now, interestingly enough, 8 months later, the only two games that are still kind of talked about for the Switch 2 or that are considered worth it are Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. I guess technically Pokemon Legends as well, but there's an overwhelming majority of that's on the Switch 1, so I don't know if that really counts. But I digress. So last week we saw that Mario Tennis Fever debuted in the UK at the number 2 position. The only game that sold more than Mario Tennis Fever was EA Sports FC 26. Then if you know something about the United Kingdom crowd, you know that EAFC does very well. So it's no shame to be second best to that game. It's also kind of fun to look at the splits here and see how low the Switch 2 version does in comparison to the other ones on a weekly basis. But in fairness, it also has a much smaller user base. Now this morning, we got the data for last week. Once again, EA Sports FC 26 takes the top spot, and for Mario Tennis Fever, it drops down all the way to 7th. It's not really a terrible drop-off from the first week. It's like mid, which I guess is kind of in line with Mario Tennis Fever. That 7 right next to it kind of fits as well. But it's not like overwhelmingly great or terrible anyway. And of course, I would not be making a video if it was just talking about the ranking going from 2nd place to 7th place, because we, again, do not know the data of how many units a game is actually selling. But over at cube3.com, where they analyze these charts, they included an interesting bit here that was relevant to Mario Tennis Fever. The quote states that the previous Mario Tennis title, Mario Tennis Aces, on Switch debuted at number 1 in all formats on the chart back in week 25, 2018. Mario Tennis Fever for the Switch 2 debuted at number 2, selling around a third of the previous title's launch week. So now we have something tangible. Now we have an actual kind of reference point to work our way off of. Instead of just a rankings chart, we have something that can work with where NintenDeen can apply his confirmation bias and spin the news negatively to his benefit. Analyze the data. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's very interesting because if it sold 1/3 of what Mario Tennis Aces did, that means it basically had the exact same drop-off in the UK that it did in Japan. That's 67% down. And similar to Japan, if you want to be very generous and include digital sales, and you consider that more people are fully digital today in comparison to when Aces came out, then that drop-off, optimistically speaking for the sake of Mario Tennis Fever, is probably around 50%. But of course, that is just speculation on my end. Now, obviously, when it comes to data that we get from Europe, it's a lot more scattered than, like, say, what we get from Japan or the US. Since we only actually get data from a few countries, and it's only if we're lucky we get a little tidbit like this where it tells you that it sold a third of what the previous one did. I'm guessing we'll hear something about Spain later this week. But something that's been fairly consistent that we saw through all of last year was the European market was pretty consistent. You had some differences overall, but in general, the vibes and the way that the sales worked and the patterns in sales throughout Europe were reflected through most Western markets, including over here in the States. So it might be too soon to say anything, but you should not be surprised if we end up finding out that Mario Tennis Fever does half of what Mario Tennis Aces did in its first quarter by the time we get to the next Nintendo financials. And obviously, we'll do a further analysis on that when we do get to those financials, but if it does indeed drop off that much, it'll be the lowest selling Switch 2 first-party game at launch, or at least amongst the main first-party games. You know, those 7 out of 10 games that are being sold for $70. And speaking of which, those games launched all of them during the holiday season quarter, so you're looking at November and December. These games that I'm talking about are obviously Hyrule Warriors, Kirby, and Metroid Prime 4. The best of these three titles was Kirby Air Riders, and that's obviously because more than half of the sales of Kirby Air Riders were done in Japan. But in Western markets, the three of those titles didn't necessarily flop, but they were underwhelming based off of the standards set by Nintendo in the previous generation. To give you an idea, Kirby Air Riders, the best of them, only sold just slightly better than ARMS, which was considered an underwhelming title last gen. And if you add the sales numbers of all three of those games, they altogether sold fewer than Splatoon 2. And then even if you add Bonanza's total to that, in the first year of the console's life, all of those games together sold fewer units than Mario Odyssey alone. The reason I am highlighting that is because those are the games that were released during the holiday season, and those were the sales numbers of the Switch 2 games, including the holiday season, and they were very much underwhelming in comparison to the Switch 1's first year. Not just in comparison to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but in comparison to even the more underwhelming titles. And I'm highlighting this because one of the biggest coping mechanisms that I'm seeing from the White Knights for the Nintendo franchise is that they're suggesting that the only reason Mario Tennis Fever has had this dramatic of a drop-off is because it launched in February, in comparison to Aces, which launched in June. And while that may have a small effect, I highly doubt it's that big of a reason as to why Mario Tennis Fever has sold so few units. It's been discussed to death, mostly by me, but it's a $70 Mario game that is basically just a reskin of the previous Mario game. Okay, I just probably described the majority of Nintendo's franchises. Basically, it's Mario Tennis Fever, but it looks like Mario Tennis Aces, and it's more expensive. $70 for a game that does not offer $70 of value. Now, is it going to flop? By the industry standard definition, it probably will not flop. It's going to be making enough money to be profitable. It may already be profitable, because clearly Nintendo did not put that much effort into this since they reused so much from the previous titles. It is going to be an evergreen title for the Switch 2, but its level of success for all of these Switch 2 titles that have so far started off much slower than you would have expected when you look at the sales of Nintendo for the past decade, is going to be largely contingent on how well the Switch 2 does. At the end of the day, this is a first-party game with Mario's face on it, so it's going to do well enough. But if all of the software sales numbers that we've seen over the last year are anything to go by, and these early launch numbers that we've seen for Mario Tennis Fever are anything to go by, Nintendo is really going to struggle to reach even half of the heights that they reached with the Switch 1 when it comes to their games because of their high price points and their evident lack of effort. And honestly, I think that's a very big reason why they are so hyper-focused on Switch 2 editions. If you remember, late last year, they said they're shifting their focus towards primarily developing for the Nintendo Switch 2. I'm guessing that means they're just going to be spitting out more and more Switch 2 edition titles, because the alternative is to try to ship out $70 games, and that additional effort that they're putting into those games, since those are not translating to sales numbers that they've grown to expect over the last decade, instead of learning from their mistakes and deciding to put in more effort so that the games are worth the price, or on the opposite side of things, deciding to drop the price so that people are actually buying the games, there's a very likely chance that most of the Switch 2 generation we're just going to be seeing more Switch 2 edition titles because they take significantly less effort, and they know that they'll get enough people to just pay $20, where it might end up being more profitable to just spit those out than to have to release a whole new game at $70. I think it's the same concept with the third parties. They're starting off with this first year, just like with every other Switch generation, or Nintendo generation, I should say, where they're putting in a lot of effort and trying to court the Nintendo fandom, showing them how hard they're working in order to optimize some of the games for the inferior hardware. But as time goes on, you're going to see them just basically do the quickest flip job and release it on the Switch, or just skip it altogether, just like in previous generations. And again, from the first party angle, it's also a very clear sign to them that the easiest way for them to make a whole lot of money and sell games at higher prices than just $20 for an upgrade pack is going to be to just port over and re-release old games with no effort into the emulation. They saw an insane amount of success by selling the Wii U games on the Switch, so now they're like, we have a whole world of Nintendo games to work with. We can just simply re-release them again, and they're gonna pay. It is very likely that by the time we get to the end of the fiscal year, we're going to see that 2 out of the top best-selling games on the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 together are going to be Mario Galaxy and Fire Red/Leaf Green. Games that basically took almost no effort to bring over to the Switch 2, and they released them at higher prices than they're worth. These early sales patterns for the Switch 2 should be a concern for Switch 2 buyers, because it really shows where Nintendo's head is right now. And it's basically in the exact same place it was during the latter years of the Switch 1's life. The idea that many expected that we would come into the Switch 2 and they'd be hitting the ground running because of how long they delayed this console, with so many titles with the longest gaps that we've ever seen between releases, the idea that we were going to be coming into this console and it was just going to be a hit after a hit after a hit is not true. 3D Mario, nothing. Zelda 40th Anniversary, nothing. Metroid, Switch 1 game. Pokemon, Switch 1 game. Pokepia, just like Kirby Air Riders, is probably going to be a lot more popular in Japan. Hyrule Warriors, I think people might be fed up with the Breath of the Wild style Zelda games, or themes rather. And finally, Bonanza, a game that released last July. If it feels like the Nintendo Switch 2 is off to a very slow start, is because it is. And if it feels like the games that have come out for the Switch 2 are underwhelming, it's because they are. Both the sales and the reviews indicate that. But this is not just a Switch 2 issue. This is a Nintendo issue that started through the last few years of the Switch 1's life. Like, if you think about how slow things got from around 2022-ish until now, you're looking at close to a 4-year window of a slow Nintendo ecosystem. That is more than half of a console generation. I think it is very disappointing how much time and effort and resources Nintendo put into making sure they have enough Switch 2 hardware available for the console's launch, going out of their way to stockpile and delay that launch as much as possible, rather than putting that time and effort into making not only good games, but great games from the great franchises that most people would want in a brand new Nintendo console. It's a very good thing the Nintendo Switch 2 is as flat as it is, because dust pans should be flat, otherwise they won't be able to collect all of that dust. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the Nintendo Treehouse.